Sarah sat nervously in the small, dimly lit waiting room, her palms damp with sweat. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, echoing in the silence. She adjusted the hem of her blouse and stared at the old-fashioned wallpaper, which seemed to peel away in some spots. The air smelled faintly of dust and something else, something unidentifiable, that made her uneasy. She had applied for the live-in babysitting position on a whim, desperate for work, with Timmy's school fees piling up and bills that never seemed to stop coming. She needed something stable, something that would give her a way to support her little boy. Mrs. Jenkins, the woman who had posted the ad, was said to be kind and generous, a widow with a large, well-kept home. The job description seemed perfect: live-in, steady pay, and she could care for her son without needing to rely on daycare. But the house was strange. Sarah glanced at the clock again. Mrs. Jenkins was late. Her heart raced. She had seen the address when she first arrived. The house was a monstrous Victorian manor, towering over the street, with windows that stared out like dark, watchful eyes. It was old, very old, and although it had been maintained, the walls whispered of its age. She had tried not to judge too quickly, but the house unsettled her. The door to the waiting room creaked open, and Mrs. Jenkins appeared in the doorway. Miss Sarah Bennett. Her voice was soft, warm, like honey, but there was something in her eyes, something that made Sarah's stomach churn. "That's me." Sarah stood, extending a hand. Mrs. Jenkins smiled and took it. Her grip was firm, but cold, and Sarah couldn't help but notice the way Mrs. Jenkins seemed to linger just a moment too long. "Please, come in. I'm so sorry to keep you waiting," Mrs. Jenkins said, stepping aside to let Sarah pass. She had an air of elegance about her, despite the faded grandeur of the house. Her dark, neatly arranged hair and pale complexion gave her an almost ethereal quality. Her wide, doe-like eyes seemed to hold secrets Sarah wasn't sure she wanted to know. As they walked through the hall, Sarah took in the grandeur of the house. Large chandeliers that hung from the ceiling like spiders' webs, dark wood paneling, and heavy, ornate furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum. "This is such a beautiful house," Sarah remarked, trying to make small talk. "Yes, it's been in my family for generations," Mrs. Jenkins replied, her voice carrying a trace of pride. "But you mustn't judge it by its appearance. It may look imposing, but it's a very warm home. You'll see. Come, sit." They entered a large, cozy sitting room with deep armchairs and a crackling fire in the fireplace. Mrs. Jenkins gestured for Sarah to sit across from her, and as Sarah did, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched by the paintings hanging on the walls. The room felt colder than it should have. Mrs. Jenkins sat down with a smooth grace, folding her hands in her lap. "I'm sure you're wondering why I've kept the position open for so long," she said. "I've had many applicants, but none of them were quite right. I'm very particular about who I hire. You see, I don't just need someone to watch my children, but someone who understands them, and more importantly, understands me." Sarah hesitated, unsure of what to say. "I can assure you that I'm a very dedicated mother," she said, her voice steady despite her growing anxiety. Mrs. Jenkins' smile softened. "I'm sure you are, dear, but the children I look after are very special. They require someone with a very delicate touch." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "Special? I'm not sure I understand." Mrs. Jenkins leaned forward, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You will, Miss Bennett, you will." She smiled again, but this time it was colder, a little more calculated. As Sarah sat there, she realized something was off, something that she couldn't quite place. Mrs. Jenkins' kindness felt too forced, like it was masking something deeper. She looked around the room, suddenly feeling the weight of the silence pressing in on her. Finally, Mrs. Jenkins broke the silence. "Well, Miss Bennett, I think you'll be perfect for the job. You can move in immediately, if that suits you. You'll have your own room, and of course, there's no need to worrying about meals or anything else. All I ask is that you be patient with the children and keep them happy. They're sensitive. Sarah nodded, her thoughts racing. She needed this job. She had no choice. Timmy needed her, and this was the best option she had. "I'll take the job," she said, her voice firm despite the dread creeping into her chest. "Wonderful." Mrs. Jenkins' smile widened, and for a moment, Sarah could have sworn she saw something dark flash in her eyes. Sarah and Timmy stood at the threshold of Mrs. Jenkins' house, bags in hand, their faces pale from the overwhelming presence of the house. The heavy wooden door closed behind them with a finality that made Sarah's heart race. The house seemed to groan in response, as if it had just welcomed a new set of souls to add to its collection. "Well, here we are," Sarah said, forcing a smile at Timmy, who clutched his stuffed bear tightly in his arms. His eyes were wide with unease, mirroring his mother's. Mrs. Jenkins ushered them inside, her warm, honeyed voice offering comfort in the otherwise cold, imposing house. "I'll show you to your rooms. You must be tired from your journey." The interior of the house was unlike anything Sarah had ever seen. Dark, plush carpets lined the hallway, and the rooms were furnished with old, yet grand, pieces of furniture. The smell of wax polish lingered in the air, mixed with an odd, earthy scent that Sarah couldn't place. It made her feel like the house had been here for centuries, watching and waiting. Mrs. Jenkins led them upstairs to a room at the end of a long hallway. The door creaked as it opened, revealing a modest space with a large bed covered in heavy, dark linens. The room was dark, but a single lamp flickered in the corner, casting long shadows on the walls. A large window overlooked the garden, though it was covered by thick, velvet curtains that blocked out any view of the outside world. "This is your room," Mrs. Jenkins said, her voice soft but insistent. "It's not much, but it's comfortable. You'll have everything you need here. Please make yourselves at home." Sarah nodded, grateful for the room even if it did feel like a cage. She smiled at Timmy, who was already hopping onto the bed, his earlier nervousness forgotten for the moment. "Thanks, Mrs. Jenkins," Sarah said, still trying to keep her tone light. "We'll settle in right away." "Good," Mrs. Jenkins said, smiling in a way that seemed to linger too long. "I'll leave you to get some rest. Dinner will be ready in an hour, so don't go too far." She gave them a polite nod before walking out, the door clicking shut behind her. Sarah sat down on the bed, running a hand through her hair. "Well, Timmy, it's not perfect, but we'll make it work, okay?" Timmy nodded and snuggled deeper into the bed, the soft sheets providing some comfort. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It was in the way the house felt too quiet, too still. There was an unnatural heaviness to the silence, and every creak of the floorboards echoed like a whisper from the past. Later that evening, Sarah sat in the small dining room with Mrs. Jenkins and her children. The table was set with fine china, but the food was sparse, just a simple soup and some bread. It wasn't what she had expected, but she wasn't going to complain. The children, a boy and a girl who looked to be about Timmy's age, ate in silence, their eyes hollow, as if they had forgotten how to smile. As the evening wore on, Sarah began to feel a sense of unease creeping in again. The house seemed to be alive, breathing with a rhythm that she couldn't quite understand. The lights flickered intermittently, casting long shadows on the walls. Every now and then, Sarah would hear soft whispers from the hallway, but when she turned to look, no one was there. After dinner, Mrs. Jenkins invited them to stay in the parlor for a while. Sarah agreed, hoping that the distraction would take her mind off the gnawing feeling in her stomach. The parlor was even grander than the dining room, filled with antique furniture and large, framed portraits of what appeared to be Mrs. Jenkins' ancestors. Their eyes seemed to follow Sarah as she moved around the room, and a cold shiver ran down her spine. "I must admit," Mrs. Jenkins said as she poured them both a glass of wine, "I've had a difficult time finding someone to stay here. It's such a large house, and, well, sometimes it feels like the walls have memories of their own." "Memories?" Sarah asked, trying to mask the discomfort in her voice. Mrs. Jenkins smiled faintly. Yes, dear, the house is old, very old, and it has seen a great many things in its time, things that the world has forgotten. But the house ... it remembers. The fire crackled in the hearth, the only sound breaking the silence that had fallen between them. Sarah felt the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. I'm sure it's just the house settling, Sarah said, her voice forced as she sipped the wine, hoping it would calm her nerves. Yes, settling, Mrs. Jenkins echoed, her smile stretching wider. Settling with its guests. Don't worry, you'll get used to it. As the night wore on, Sarah felt the weight of exhaustion press down on her. She knew she needed rest, but her mind kept replaying the strange events of the evening. She kissed Timmy goodnight and tucked him into bed before heading back to her own room. But as she lay in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, she could hear the sounds again, soft whispers that seemed to echo through the walls, followed by a faint scratching noise like nails on wood. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, it was filled with nightmares. The next morning, Sarah woke up to an eerie silence. The whispers of the previous night seemed to have vanished, but the feeling of unease still lingered in the air. She rubbed her eyes, trying to shake off the remnants of her restless sleep. Timmy was still asleep beside her, his small face peaceful. But Sarah knew better than to believe everything was as it seemed. She felt it in the pit of her stomach. The house was hiding something. After breakfast, Sarah made her way into the garden with Timmy, hoping to get some fresh air and shake off the unease. Mrs. Jenkins had mentioned that the children liked to play outside, and Sarah was hoping to introduce Timmy to them. They could all play together, she thought, and maybe it would help her feel a bit more at ease. As they walked along the garden path, Sarah noticed that the houses in the neighborhood looked almost deserted. There were no children playing in the yards, no neighbors chatting by the fences, and the air was thick with a quiet that was more oppressive than peaceful. She glanced over at Timmy, whose face was hidden behind his stuffed bear. He too seemed to sense the oddness of the situation. Are we going to play with the other kids, Mommy? Timmy asked, his voice small. Of course, Sarah said, forcing a smile. We'll meet the other kids soon. But as the day wore on, Sarah noticed something unsettling. As she ventured into the village, she realized that there were no children to be found, not a single one. The few adults she saw seemed distracted, as if they were deliberately avoiding eye contact. When Sarah tried to ask about the children, they quickly turned away or muttered something under their breath, never quite meeting her gaze. It wasn't just strange, it was terrifying. That evening, as Sarah prepared dinner in the kitchen, Mrs. Jenkins approached her, as if reading her mind. Have you noticed the neighborhood? She asked, her tone light but with a hidden edge. It's quiet around here. The children have been gone for a while. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Gone? What do you mean gone? Mrs. Jenkins gave a small shrug, her smile never faltering. Oh, it's nothing really. The children here have a tendency to wander off sometimes. A few days, a week at most. They always come back, eventually. But some of them, well, they get lost. Sarah swallowed, unsure whether she was hearing the truth or something far darker. She had heard rumors of missing children, but it couldn't be true. Not here, not in this small town. I'm sure they'll turn up, Mrs. Jenkins said dismissively, as if the matter was of no consequence. You needn't worry. They always come back. But Sarah could feel the coldness in Mrs. Jenkins' voice. It didn't sound like reassurance, it sounded like something far more sinister. Later that night, as Sarah tucked Timmy into bed, she noticed something odd. The room next to theirs, the one that belonged to Mrs. Jenkins' children, was eerily quiet. No sounds of giggles, no faint footsteps. Sarah had never heard the children's laughter, not once since arriving. She couldn't remember the last time they had even spoken to her. The next morning, she tried again to ask Mrs. Jenkins about the children, but Mrs. Jenkins changed the subject so quickly that it left Sarah feeling even more unsettled. Something was wrong. There were no other children in the neighborhood. The adults were all too quiet, and the house, The house seemed to hold secrets. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being drawn deeper into something she couldn't control. The children hadn't disappeared. They had been taken. And the more Sarah thought about it, the more she began to suspect that Mrs. Jenkins was the one behind it all. The following days passed slowly, each one stretching into the next, weighed down by an ever-growing sense of dread. Sarah kept a watchful eye on Timmy, ensuring that he stayed close and safe. But no matter how many times she asked Mrs. Jenkins about the other children, the answers remained evasive, too quick, too rehearsed. There were no children around, not even in the backyard, and Mrs. Jenkins seemed perfectly content to let the mystery unfold at its own pace. But Sarah couldn't ignore the chilling feeling in her gut. Something wasn't right. It wasn't until one evening, after a rather unsettling dinner where Sarah once again pressed Mrs. Jenkins about the children's whereabouts, that things began to take an even darker turn. "I think it's time you learned more about my special children," Mrs. Jenkins said with an eerie calmness in her voice, her smile never faltering. "What do you mean special?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling despite her attempts to sound composed. "You'll see soon enough," Mrs. Jenkins replied cryptically, her gaze lingering on Sarah for a moment longer than comfortable. "There are games they enjoy playing, you see. It's a part of their upbringing. You'll need to participate. Of course, I've already told you that patience is key." Sarah's blood ran cold. She had tried to remain polite, tried to play along, but something about Mrs. Jenkins' tone made her skin crawl. She could no longer ignore the sensation that she was trapped in something far darker than she could comprehend. Later that evening, after dinner, Mrs. Jenkins led Sarah down to the basement. Timmy was already in bed, oblivious to the sinister turn of events that was unfolding. The basement door creaked open, and the air grew thick with a musty, stale odor. The stairs creaked underfoot as they descended, and Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. At the bottom of the stairs, Mrs. Jenkins stopped. "Here we are," she said, opening the door to a large, dimly lit room. The room was filled with toys, bizarre and unsettling toys, some of which looked like they had been there for decades. It was an odd mixture of a playroom and a prison cell, with old dolls, stuffed animals, and strange, mismatched furniture scattered around. "Do you see, dear? They need to be entertained. They get restless without their games." Sarah tried to steady her breath. "What kind of games are you talking about?" Mrs. Jenkins smiled again, this time with a gleam in her eyes that sent a chill down Sarah's spine. "You'll find out soon enough. But for now, let me introduce you to the children." The door on the far side of the room creaked open, and from the shadows emerged the figures, pale, wide-eyed children, their faces blank and expressionless. They looked no older than Timmy, but something about them felt wrong, unnatural. They shuffled forward slowly, like they were in a trance. "These are my special ones," Mrs. Jenkins said. "I keep them close. Well, let's just say they're very important." The children didn't speak. They simply stood there, staring at Sarah with an unsettling, blank expression. Mrs. Jenkins clapped her hands together. "Startling, Sarah. It's time to play the game. I need you to participate. Of course, the children enjoy it when you play along." A cold shiver ran down Sarah's spine as she watched the children begin to move toward her, their eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her stomach twist. She took a step back, instinctively protecting herself. "I don't want to play," Sarah said, her voice shaky. "This is too much. I need to leave." Mrs. Jenkins' smile remained, but it no longer seemed welcoming. "You don't have a choice, dear," she said softly, almost sweetly. "You've been chosen. This is your role now. You'll learn to be patient with them, to play with them. I need you to be a good caretaker for them. Don't disappoint me, Sarah." Fear clawed at Sarah's throat. She tried to move toward the door, but her legs felt as though they were made of lead. The children, still silent, began to inch closer, their feet barely making a sound on the cold concrete floor. "Mrs. Jenkins, please," Sarah's plea was cut off by the sound of the door slamming shut behind her. She turned, heart racing, but Mrs. Jenkins was no longer standing by the door. The woman was gone, leaving Sarah alone with the two children, whose eyes had now narrowed with eerie focus. The children raised their hands at the same time, and Sarah could feel her body trembling, her mind racing for an escape plan. But the room felt like a cage. She had no choice but to follow through. They wanted a game. She'd give them one. She just needed to survive the night. But as she glanced at the children still silent, their eyes empty, she couldn't help but feel the dark weight of Mrs. Jenkins' words. You'll learn to play with them,